I've waited a long time for this, ladies and gentlemen. The Steam Deck is finally here. Finally got mine. It took a while for it to get here, but it is in my hands. I'm here to tell you all about it. Suffice to say, I'm very impressed with this device, and it's certainly changed the habits that I have when it comes to PC gaming. So let's break this device down, starting with the unboxing. It's actually a very minimalist box, and the Steam Deck comes in this case that has no right to be as good as it is. Let me show you right here what that case looks like. You open it up, and you can see the contour of the Steam Deck is kind of fully represented. So the Steam Deck just kind of slots right in, like so, and it's very easy to just close it up, zip it up, and be on your way. And beyond that, there's like little extra features. Like at the bottom here, there's a pocket where you can essentially put your power cord if you so desire. I'm going to put this on the side. It also comes with this pouch, so you can put stuff in your pouch and then slot that in here, carry it like that, safe and sound. The material of this case is just nice and sturdy. You can hear that, very solid. Just a case that comes included with the device. I know it's weird to compliment the case so much, but no other portable gaming device really comes with a case, and the one that the Steam Deck does come with, it doesn't feel like they just kind of cheapened out on it and threw it in there. They put a lot of thought into it, and it's the only case you'll really ever need. I love that this is included. But enough about the case. You want to know more about the device. Now, as far as specs are concerned, I'm going to go ahead and just put that up on the screen. I feel like we have been through the specs enough. You can go to the Steam Deck website and check it out for yourself. But the main thing to note is that the Steam Deck does house a more sort of custom, more proprietary SoC. It is AMD, but it would seem as though, according to Valve, they have kind of tweaked things for their own purposes. And the results are quite beautiful. This beast right here can perform on a level that, when it comes to PC gaming, definitely edges out the other devices that I've used so far. But we'll get to that in a bit. As for the overall hardware here, this is a device that, yes, it's sizable, but it's still very much portable. If we compare it to the Nintendo Switch right here, you can see it is definitely significantly longer. But the screen size is roughly about the same, except this is a 16:10 aspect ratio. This is a 16:9. Now you can see that a significant portion of the width is taken up by just how big this sort of controller area is, because they need to house all of the different inputs, which I'll talk about in a bit. Thickness-wise, yeah, it's not as thick as other devices like the One X Player. If I bring that into the fold, you can see that this is quite a chunky device. It made up a lot of the lack in length with that extra thickness to give it enough thermal performance. The Steam Deck is longer, but makes up for it in additional thinness. So the dimensions of the Steam Deck, based on my measurements, were 11 3/4 inches length, 4.5 inches tall, and then thickness-wise, at the thinnest point, it's about 3/4 inches, and at the thickest point here, we're looking at roughly 1 inch and 1/4. It is definitely among the bigger devices. It's actually comparable to the chonky One X Player here with the 8-inch screen, but this has more screen and less sort of inputs here. The Steam Deck has more inputs, but a smaller screen. Thickness-wise, the Steam Deck, though, is definitely a lot thinner. The One X Player here is almost as long as the Steam Deck, but not quite. And the weight of the Steam Deck is also pretty comfortable. We're looking at 1.475 pounds of weight, which is close to the One X Player Mini's 1.36 pounds. This is slightly heavier, but honestly, the Steam Deck's weight is so well balanced that the device doesn't feel all that heavy at all. And what especially helps is how good these grips are. You can see right here how much they protrude. These feel like proper controller handles, comparable to holding an Xbox controller or a DualSense controller. It's just got that confident grip on the back where your fingers aren't just wrapping around them, they're actually holding on to the back. And so this just makes this an extremely easy to handle device. Compare that with something like the Switch, which is just a flat back, and it's just, it's a little more awkward to hold that, though this is a lighter device and a smaller device, but still, a grip is just nice to have. The One X Player Mini comes close to the Steam Deck, but the protrusion is not quite as prominent as the Steam Decks. You get a good amount of grip here, but it's just not that, like you're really holding on to it kind of sensation that you get with this huge grip protrusion on the Steam Deck, which is honestly my preference. Rather my device be thicker if it means just greater comfort, especially when we're at roughly 1.5 pounds of weight. So I'd say of all the portable consoles and portable PCs I've used so far, the Steam Deck gives me the most confidence in holding it. It's the most comfortable device I've held so far. This also does overall feel like a premium device. I mean, it is plastic, but it's very rigid. You try to bend it and it really doesn't give. There's a bit of rattle when you shake it though. You can kind of hear it, I believe. And there are some parts of the device that will creak if you apply a bit of pressure. Like the bottom here, if you squeeze that, there's just a bit of that creaking. But in the grand scheme of things, the complaints that I do have are minor nitpicks. When you're just using the device normally, you're not going to really hear much in the way of creaking or rattling because you're just kind of holding it like this and playing. Speaking of playing, let's dive into some of these inputs, starting with the analog sticks, which are straight up just full-fledged analog sticks on the same level as an Xbox controller or a PlayStation controller. It's pretty much got that level of range of movement, so it feels fantastic. It does take a bit of getting used to because the positioning is a little more inwards than your usual controller. Usually you're kind of over here or in this position or in this position when you're holding the analog sticks or when you're placing your thumbs on your analog sticks. You do have to extend out a little bit, and then pushing the analog sticks inwards means you have to even go further when it comes to extending your thumb. So it took about like an hour or two for me to just get used to that placement and to remember that my placement here isn't diagonal, it's horizontal. So going back to the D-pad, I'd always kind of go down here and forget that the trackpad is there and that the D-pad is actually over here. Same with the face buttons. This kind of motion and switching back and forth between the two input types on each side, that took a bit of getting used to, but it's just muscle memory. Once you get used to it though, it's a very comfortable positioning. It's easy to reach all the buttons, and the overextension of the thumb that maybe you're not quite as used to is kind of a non-issue. With my one complaint being that on the left analog stick especially, there is a noticeable amount of friction where it feels like plastic rubbing on plastic when the analog stick hits the edge and you rotate. I don't know if you can hear it. That kind of grinding noise. There's just a bit more friction there than I'd like, whereas the 1X Player Mini, it's pretty much dead silent. I don't know if this will come across through the microphone, but there's just this feeling of like sandpaper grinding on the analog stick. It's not super prominent, but it's there enough that you notice it. It's a little better on the right analog stick. It feels a lot smoother. Like there isn't much in the way of friction, but there's still a little bit of that on the right analog stick as well. Whereas the 1X Player Mini, it's very smooth. It feels like the analog sticks are slipping through the edges instead of grinding through them. It's a very small complaint in the grand scheme of things, but I just like the feeling of this being as smooth as possible. But these are just larger, more full-fledged analog sticks, so I ultimately prefer these over the 1X players. Next up, we got the face buttons. These feel pretty much near identical to an Xbox controllers when it comes to the amount of sort of give that it has, the tactility, and when you hold it down, it feels confidently held down. It doesn't feel like it'll depress and repress. Just really light to the touch, easy to press, nice and tactile, and smaller in size overall compared to like the Xbox Series' face buttons here, but similar in feel, I'd say. Yeah, and similar in sound even. Next up is the D-pad, which I do overall like. I do prefer the one on the 1X Player Mini though, because it has less travel, it's a bit easier to press, and it's less stiff. The Steam Deck's D-pad is very much usable, it's not bad at all, but it feels like you have to press down quite a bit before you kind of trigger the button. And beyond that, there is a bit of too much resistance, I'd say, which makes the D-pad just a little less responsive, but the directions register really nicely. Then let's go to the shoulder and trigger buttons. The positioning is something that takes a bit of getting used to because you're usually used to the shoulder buttons kind of being sort of right here, closer to the edge. These are a little further in because just the way you hold the Steam Deck device, this is actually not very comfortable. You do want these shoulder buttons a little further in for the purposes of this particular device contour. And overall, these are really good shoulder buttons. I do like the one on the One X Player Mini a little more because with the Steam Deck, there's a bit of like that springy, squishy kind of feel to the button before it clicks. It's like squish and then click. Whereas with the One X Player Mini, it's rigid until you press it. It's just on or off. It's just not moving at all or it's clicking. So it's a much more instantaneous kind of button press. Whereas the Steam Deck, there's a bit of a give, like there's a slight springiness, a bit of a squeeze before the click comes in. Still a very good shoulder button overall. It's not like games were made unplayable by this. And finally, the trigger buttons I really like. They feel nice and smooth to press. Whereas the One X Player's triggers, it does feel a bit like there's plastic grinding on plastic. These triggers feel like they're kind of floating. When you press, it almost feels frictionless. Now, I do wish there was a bit more resistance on these analog sticks. It's far too easy to just like press all the way down. When you want to press it halfway, there isn't enough resistance to allow you to do that in an accurate way or as accurate as you'd like, whereas the One X Player Minis, not only are the triggers just kind of a little bigger, there's enough resistance where you can really kind of slowly press the buttons down and have more nuanced control over the analog aspect of these triggers. And I like the way these sound and just the feel of it. These triggers are still very good, but it feels, I don't know, slippery, I guess, in terms of trying to gauge a good level of analog press, but it's just like buttons. They feel really great to press. And hell, the fact that it's a lighter, less resistant press might mean that for shooters, it'll actually be more comfortable because you're going to be pressing this button quite often, and the lesser resistance means you can do this a lot easily. Just that multiple press or the burst fire that you do just kind of comes a little easier. So these are good feeling buttons overall. Nothing about any of these inputs is bad. There are just some aspects of the One X Player Mini's inputs that I prefer, but the face buttons and analog sticks on the Steam Deck are far superior and feel like traditional controllers, analog sticks and face buttons combined with the grip just makes this a very comfortable controller, if you will, to handle. Overall, I love the way this feels. You've got Start and Select right here. These are kind of the more mushier, pillowy, squishy kind of buttons, but still tactile enough where they feel high quality. Then you've got the trackpads here. These are invaluable. I love that these are here, and this is one of the things that separates Steam Deck from other devices, especially for desktop navigation, where you can see the mouse moves very smoothly and very responsively to my inputs, to my thumb swipes. I can, bring up Firefox here, and I can also just very easily just interact with the interface. The mouse movement just follows my thumb movement very well. I can use the left trackpad as a scroll wheel, like so, and there's just so much customizability to these trackpads. And this is just desktop mode we're talking about. In gaming, there's even more you can do with them. So I just booted up Control right here so I can go into the controller configuration menu and show you just all the different ways the trackpads can be used. So right here, I can use it as a mouse, a button pad, a directional pad, joystick, flick stick, scroll wheel. Radio menu is fantastic. So if you're playing a first-person shooter, for example, like I was playing Black Mesa, and you got 1 through 5 for the different weapon categories, you can set the different parts of the trackpad to mean the different numbers. So this could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so I just have to hit one of these buttons, select a weapon, and I'm switching weapons very quickly that way. Or for MMOs, you can use a radio menu, you can use a hotbar menu. You can just do so many different things. Directional swipe, single button, mouse region. So these are very highly customizable, and depending on the game, you might be able to make some really interesting controller schemes. Another feature of the trackpads that kind of gives you more control over them is haptic feedback, which was the case for the Steam controllers trackpads here. They kind of brought that back with the Steam Deck. While the haptics aren't as strong as on the Steam controller, they have just less room to work with here. It's still very solid feeling, and as you scroll, you can feel the ticks, if you will, of the haptic feedback. The ticks you get when you use your scroll wheel on your mouse. It's that you kind of feel that on the trackpads. I don't know if the microphone will pick it up here. That sound is being made by the vibration of the haptics, and they very much help in just being able to gauge just from feeling how fast you're scrolling, whether it's your mouse or your camera. The trackpads can also be used for two-finger keyboard typing. So right here you can see, as I move my fingers around, it places the cursor, the two cursors on the different buttons, so I can type the space quick. You can see it takes a bit of getting used to. Quick, space, brown, fox. You get the idea. So yeah, it definitely takes a bit of playing around with. It's not as fast as using your just a regular keyboard or even just typing directly on the screen, but it saves you from having to just like readjust your hand constantly if you get used to this. And also, it's something that you can get used to using in not just, mouse-heavy games like, grand strategy titles and stuff like that. In shooters, the trackpads can be quite effective. So let me boot up Control here and show you exactly what I mean. So you can use the trackpad to pan the camera around slowly or as fast as your thumb moves. You can also flick it to do sort of a 180 turn if an enemy's right behind you, and then boom, you're already taking aim. Let me actually change the weapon here. You take an aim, maybe I want to shoot those lights right there using the gyroscopic controls that are activated by, so right here you can see, camera's not moving, and then the capacitive touch here activates the gyroscopes because that's just the way I have it set up. So you can use the trackpad to do big camera movements, use the gyros to do smaller, more nuanced movements that allow you to take aim at things in the distance and just give you that level of precision. So right here I can just take aim, shoot that enemy. Let's kill this guy right here. Flick the trackpad to watch the enemy coming from that direction. I can use the back buttons right here to do things like dash. And then I can use the analog stick's capacitive touch. You can see right here. That also, you see the camera's not turning. Then the capacitive touch on the analog stick, I have it so it triggers the gyroscope. So now I'm aiming with the analog stick and pulling off shots like so with the gyro aiming. I can also, use the trackpad here to grab this thing and then throw it back at the enemy. Look here, then look back like so. Use the back button to dash out of the way. Let's grab this grenade, throw it back at this enemy, and then use the gyros to finish him off. Boom, dash again. You can see just how much fidelity I have when it comes to precise aiming. I can grab this thing, use the gyros to aim up here. Maybe there's an enemy behind me. I use the trackpad to swipe and look back. Or I can just keep my thumb on the trackpad and just use the trackpad. But you can see right there how quickly I turned. So I'm able to just, in very just precise and quick fashion, take aim. And really just feel awesome taking these enemies down. Let's switch to this weapon right here. Take aim. There's more of like a sniper-esque kind of weapon. So precision for that is definitely recommended and required. And having the gyro controls there, so I can dash here, swipe, 180 turn, or just maintain my thumb on the trackpad. Do these smaller movements here, but for even smaller movements, the gyro. Take them down, boom. It's just, shooters just feel incredible. Other games I've tried with gyro controls include Metroid Prime Trilogy with Prime Hack. Just works incredibly well. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. Able to pull off headshots easily with those gyroscopic controls enabled alongside either the analog stick capacitive touch or the trackpad's capacitive touch. Now, one thing I will say is that the trackpads on the Steam Deck are a little smaller than on the Steam controller. And the circular shape and just the way it's kind of contoured around your finger's motion, it's not actually fully flat on the Steam controller. That's not here on the Steam Deck. It's just straight up flat. It's a square shape. It's a little smaller. So just more nuanced movements are, I think, a little more difficult than on the Steam controller. But overall, it's comparable enough that jumping from Steam controller trackpad controls to Steam Deck's trackpad controls, I personally felt pretty at home with it. I also want to go into more detail about these back buttons, the pedals, which are nice and stiff. So while there were a few occasions where I did accidentally press some of the buttons, because of how stiff it is, you really have to consciously press these buttons for the most part. if you're pressing sort of more on the inside of the buttons, it's a much lighter touch. This right here presses much easier than here. So that's something to note. The last two buttons that I want to talk about are the Steam and Quick Access buttons. I will say these are the worst feeling buttons on the Steam Deck. You can barely feel that they're being pressed. They're kind of this pillowy, mushy feel, but without the tactility or enough travel distance to be able to always gauge whether you're pressing them or not. That you can barely feel the button presses there. So I don't like the way these feel, but they're functional enough, certainly. With the Steam button, you're going to bring up the Steam home menu where you can go home. Right here, you can check which app is currently running, in this case, Control Ultimate Edition. So if you go home, you get this menu where you can check out your most recently played or installed games, among other things like what's new, what your friends are doing, recommended. Scrolling further down, you've just got things like special offers and other menus to take you where you need to go. From there, you can go to your library and check out what's great on deck, what's approved for Steam Deck, all the games that you own, the stuff you have installed, and then non-Steam games like emulators and ROMs you can see right here. Then from there, you have the store that you can access very easily through this Steam button. You can check out your friends and your chats, your media, so your photos and screenshots and videos that you have saved, everything you've downloaded, and then you've got your settings and power. Also, it's from the power menu that you can access switch to desktop. You can also just hold down the power button here to access that menu where you can sleep, shut down, restart, change account, or switch to desktop. And speaking of which, yes, the power button's situated here on the right-hand side, and then the plus and minus buttons here for volume. They're right here, nice and easy to press. Oh, and one of the cool things about the power button is you can pretty much pause any game during gameplay if you just kind of want to put it down for a bit and come back to it later. You can see right here, I'm pressing the power button to boot it back up. Control is right there, readily available for me to keep playing. And I know I was in the main menu there, but even during gameplay, it'll work. There was like one or two instances during emulation where resuming the game after putting the device to sleep kind of messed things up and crashed the game, or the audio glitched out and stuff like that, where I had to restart the game. But those instances are few and far between. Now, last but not least for inputs, I want to talk about the Quick Settings button, which is my favorite button on this device because it gives you access to so much useful stuff. You've got things like notifications, your friends tab where you can see what your friends are up to and interact with them, engage with them. Then you've got the quick settings menu. You can adjust things like brightness, audio settings. Right now I have my audio muted. And then microphone settings as well, alongside airplane mode, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, night mode. And you can adjust here whether you want to turn on or off the game rumble and the Steam haptics. Now, the tab that I've spent a lot of time in is this one right here, performance. You've got everything from battery life information to things like various controls to adjust frame rate, to adjust the thermal power, to manually adjust the GPU clock, and that way you can either make a gameplay experience smoother. If a game tends to run at 45 frames per second instead of 60 frames per second, it tends to run between 45 and 50. If you limit the frame rate to 45, it'll stay at a constant 45 instead of going from 45 to 50 to 55 back down to 40 and making for just a more stuttery experience. So for those types of games where there's a lot of fluctuation, you can limit the refresh rate and you can make adjustments down to 40 frames per second as so. And you can limit the frame rate here from 40 to half to 20, all the way down to 10. Or you can keep it at 60 here and limit the frame rate to 60, 30, and 15. Or you can set it to 45 here and keep it at 45 like so. Beyond that, being able to limit the TDP from 15 all the way down to 3. And then being able to limit the GPU clock from 1600 all the way down to, 200 or 300? All the way down to 200 means you have a lot of control over battery life. And I'll get to that in a bit, but this menu right here is godsend. And beyond that, you can also turn on performance metrics. Right on the corner here, you can see 60 frames per second. I'm at performance overlay level 1, but you can get it to 2 to show even more data. 3 shows even more, and 4 really gives you the full suite of information you need to gauge performance. This is just such a convenient menu. You don't have to download extra software like in other devices to achieve the same thing. It's all at your fingertips, so you actually want to fiddle with this kind of stuff. It doesn't feel inconvenient. This is a huge feature that separates Steam Deck from other competitors I've tried so far love the performance tab here. And what's cool is that you can have different settings for different games, and Steam Deck will just recognize what game you've booted up and set the settings accordingly by simply triggering the use per game profile. So if you turn this off, it'll use the global profile, the default profile. If you turn this on, it'll say, all right, these are the settings for specifically Control Ultimate Edition or whatever game you have booted up, and it'll remember that and just save the settings exactly as you remember. So if there's some games where you want to limit the frame rate to 30 or 45, you don't have to go back and readjust that. The Steam Deck will just remember as long as you hit that use per game profile button and keep that tab on. And what really brings Steam Deck together is the amount of community support surrounding it. On one hand, the fact that you have so many customization options does mean that it can be overwhelming. I mean, just editing the layout here, editing the gyroscopic controls, which you do want to fine-tune before you use based on your preferences. I, tweak them usually for every game. And you can see right here, you can customize just a whole lot. Sensitivity, vertical sensitivity, scale, acceleration, and all these different elements. And it can get a bit overwhelming if you're not necessarily someone who tweaks stuff very often. But what's cool about Steam is the community surrounding it and the way they encourage community support. So you can go up here and go to community layouts, and there's so many different profiles you can download that just kind of automatically have everything set the way you mostly want it. And if there's some things you want to tweak, you can always, select the one that you want and then go to edit layout and then kind of add your own little extra customizations. Having that community support is invaluable. That has allowed me to very easily just download a lot of the gyroscopic configurations that other people are using, tweak a little bit, and be on my way without having to just mess with every single game's layout. And beyond that, Steam's software just feels more mature. Yeah, it's not running Windows, but things like gyroscopic controls, the 1X Player Mini here includes gyros in there, but the support for it is basically non-existent. I have to use this third-party community-created application called Handheld Companion, and it's far from perfect. It's sort of hit or miss. Sometimes it'll work well, sometimes it won't. Whereas with Steam Deck, because of Steam's gyroscopic support, thanks to the Steam controller, which kind of walked so the Steam Deck could sprint, and the community support extends beyond just being able to download controller configurations. It's also just people coming up with really cool software like EmuDeck, which is this one-stop shop where it just automatically installs all of the emulators you'll ever need. You can see right here how I have it all set up: 3DS games, Game Boy Advance games, GameCube, Switch, Wii U, PlayStation 2, and in them are the various ROMs. Support like that, where people are just constantly making cool stuff, that's something you get with Steam Deck and with the Steam community that you don't get with other brands. And usually if you have a question, you have a problem, there's usually an answer online because the Steam community is so active. But just keep in mind that the Steam Deck is a tweaker's device. It's like the difference between iOS and Android. With iOS, everything's simple. That would be like your Nintendo Switch. Everything just kind of runs. You really don't have to tweak much of anything. With Android, you can really customize your navigation experience and all kinds of things. Some people do prefer the simplicity of iOS. They don't want to worry about customization at all. They don't want to be overwhelmed by so many options. They just want the thing to work and run. Android users like how deep they can delve into tailoring that device to exactly what they need out of it and customizing every aspect of it. Steam Deck is very much in that vein where it's going to overwhelm people who prefer simplicity, but tweakers are going to love the flexibility and the amount of control and autonomy you have over it. Now, it's worth noting that the software of Steam Deck still has some ways to go before I would declare it a 1.0 kind of situation. There is compatibility issues. Certain games just straight up don't work on the Steam Deck. Halo Infinite, because of, I think, anti-cheat, just can't run on this device. I tried booting up Batman Arkham Knight, and it does say on the Steam Deck store listing that the Steam Deck doesn't support it, but there's some games where, like, it'll say it doesn't support it, but it still runs fine. What the unsupported mark means, it just says that the game hasn't officially been tested and tweaked to run on Steam Deck. It doesn't necessarily mean that the game won't run on Steam Deck. Some games just, even without any tweaks or modifications or extra bit of programming, just straight up can run on this device. But other games like Arkham Knight just don't run on this thing. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, I know I've seen some people run it, but for some reason for me, I've tried everything. Every time I booted, it just crashes with this error message. Now, stuff like that will eventually get sorted out over time. It just does mean that for certain games that you are maybe excited to play on the Steam Deck, there is some waiting that you'll have to do. And also, things like Game Pass support are still not here for Steam Deck. That is a powerful combination right there. The Netflix of games plus this portable device that can handle so many of these games. But currently, there's just no official support, or I don't even know of an unofficial way to get Game Pass games running on Steam Deck. So things like that limit the full potential of this device, but that will change over time as these constant updates continue to roll out. Something else many people might have to deal with is just the Linux operating system, which is one that I really haven't used until the Steam Deck. Basically, I've used Mac and Windows. I've never really delved into Linux. So there's a bit of a learning curve in getting used to that operating system. Fortunately, the Steam Deck's version of Linux, a lot of it in terms of the user interface looks pretty much like a Windows type of interface. I mean, you've got your desktop here, you've got your different icons here, you've got your start button, essentially, all your applications and everything. So basic navigation is fine. That's well and easy. But if you want to get to those more like in-depth fixes or adding functionalities and downloading certain things and tweaking certain things, that's where you kind of always have to search online for a solution, because you know maybe how to do that stuff in Windows but not on Linux, and that's been a bit of a learning curve for me. But that also means I'm familiarizing myself with Linux, and it's always been an operating system that I've been interested in learning about. So hey, maybe it's ultimately for the better, but just keep that in mind for those who have not used Linux. It's going to take some getting used to. And also worth noting is that for functionalities outside SteamOS, you will be switching back and forth between desktop mode and SteamOS mode a lot. So for emulation, for example, if I want to tweak something in the settings, it tends to be that I have to do it here in desktop mode. So for example, Yuzu, maybe I want to change the input. I want to change the controls a little bit. I'd have to do it here on desktop, go to configure here, and tweak whatever I want to tweak here, and then exit out of all of this, and then go back to gaming mode here, wait for the Steam Deck to kind of shut down the desktop mode stuff, boot into SteamOS, wait for all of this to happen. It's that back and forth transition that does take up a lot of time, and desktop mode is required for certain, more extraneous things that you want to do with this device, like emulation. And so that can be that can take some getting used to and can take up a lot of time. Whereas with Windows, you're just in Windows and you can easily navigate through all of that. It's also worth noting that SteamOS still does have a few host of bugs that aren't, like game breaking or device breaking per se, but can occasionally be annoying and disruptive. There were a few times where the device just froze, forcing me to restart, and this was while navigating SteamOS. I've not had any major issues during gameplay, but sort of navigating the menu sometimes, either it'll freeze up or the inputs will stop working, only the touchscreen works and the buttons will stop working for some reason. There was this one time where the battery tracker on my device just showed that my battery was draining. It went from like 100% to 3% in a matter of minutes. That freaked me out. It made me think that there was something wrong with my battery, but it was just the indicator that was completely wrong. I had to look up a fix for that, which was basically drain the battery, leave it charging overnight, and then things will recalibrate, which did work. And then most recently, while filming this review, for some reason, when I exited out of Control to show something and try to boot back into it, Control just wouldn't load. I had to restart the device so Control would load again. So there are annoyances like that where you can tell there is a lot more room for refinement. Nothing utterly disastrous, just, sort of that death by 100 or 1,000 cuts type of situation where it'd be nice for these things to get ironed out eventually. And that's really the main area where Steam Deck needs to improve, or things that you need to take into consideration when it comes to flaws. It's the bugs that need to get ironed out. It's that separation between desktop mode and SteamOS mode and the constant going back and forth. It's having to get used to Linux and its compatibility issues that currently may not allow you to play certain games that you'd love to play on this thing, but just isn't possible right now. But given that this stuff can get resolved with software updates in the future, and given how well Steam Deck performs when it comes to playing PC games, and also, to a degree, emulation, it's almost worth it. It's worth the weight of ironing that stuff out, and it's worth dealing with that stuff now before it gets sorted out, because the portable gaming experience, which is what this device primarily is for, is so freaking excellent. But before we delve into performance, let's talk about some of the outputs of this device. We've got the 7-inch screen here, 16 by 10, 1280 by 800. You won't have to deal with resolution issues at all. This device is just 1280 by 800, and on a 7-inch screen, it honestly looks great. Now, this is an IPS screen. It's not the best screen in the world. It does have a little bit of backlight bleed sort of towards the top left side, which bothers me a little bit, but I've seen worse. I just really hope that OLED becomes standardized and normalized with future Steam Deck iterations, but this screen certainly gets the job done more than fine. It gets bright enough. In direct sunlight, it's not going to do you any good. Now, this does have the anti-glare coating, so let's see if I can actually show you the difference here. So if I shift this device like so, the reflection kind of shows, and then if I do the same here, you can see that it looks blurrier on the Steam Deck. And when it comes to light sources, it kind of blurs it out a little bit, whereas the One X Player Mini and other similar devices without that anti-glare feel closer to like a mirror. This feels more like, I don't know, like a mirror that's drunk, if that makes sense. The anti-glare does make a difference, but not so much so that direct sunlight is viable. But for less prominent reflection or light sources, you'll be glad that the anti-glare is there to just kind of make it easier on the eyes to see what's going on the screen itself. So yeah, that's kind of what that looks like. Now, one thing that kind of blows me away about the Steam Deck is how good its speakers are. Compared to the One X players or the Nintendo Switch, like it's not even a comparison. There's rich sound in the lows, mids, and highs. Everything comes off very clearly. It gets louder than your traditional portable gaming device. It's not going to rock the house by any means, but for the size of the Steam Deck, the fact that they were able to fit such competent speakers is just kind of incredible. With every other device, I would want to have headphones on. With the Steam Deck, I feel very comfortable about gaming without headphones because these speakers are so good, especially at the distance that you're going to be playing the Steam Deck at. And they're front-facing speakers, so the sound really does blast right towards you, and directionality is pretty decent. These are just fantastic speakers for the form factor. The ports on this device, there aren't really many, which is unfortunate. You've got the 3.5mm headphone jack. You do have a micro SD card slot towards the bottom, up to 1 terabyte, I believe, and I have a 1 terabyte inserted in there. Plenty of games installed there. They all run great through the SD card, and loading times, slightly slower on the SD card, but nothing so major in terms of difference that it cripples the experience. Like, you'll be just fine loading games onto the micro SD card, and you can very easily take one out, swap it in for another, have multiple micro SD cards at the ready. And because the case has that pocket on the back, maybe that's where you can carry the micro SD cards that you want to have with you if you somehow have, more than 1.5 terabytes worth of games that you want to have installed at the same time. I do wish that the Steam Deck had more than one USB-C. I wish it had a USB-C, a second one at the bottom, and one USB-A, which is exactly what the One X Player has here. 2 USB-Cs, one USB-A, and the micro SD card slot. The One X Player Mini does it even better with the USB-C at the top and one at the bottom here on top of the USB-A, though this does not come with the micro SD card slot, which is baffling to me, which is why the USB-A on this device is taken up by this micro SD card reader, but it still has 2 extra USB-Cs to take advantage of, whereas with Steam Deck, say I want to, transfer some stuff from a USB-C SSD into this device while charging. I can't do that. I have to plug it in, wait until it charges up, and then unplug it, insert the USB-C SSD, and then do whatever I want and hope the battery doesn't run out by the time I'm done with whatever it is I'm doing. So that's an inconvenience. I think it needs just an extra USB-C at least, preferably an extra USB-C at the bottom, and also a USB-A. Hopefully Steam Deck 2 will have that implementation. All right, so that finally brings us to performance. Everything running at 1280 by 800. This is where the device really shines above and beyond anything I've tried so far. Let's begin with the less demanding games. We've got Hades running at 60 frames per second, runs perfectly, flawlessly. Same goes for Dark Souls Remastered, 60 frames per second, everything maxed out, no issues whatsoever. I also downloaded Dragon's Dogma recently to celebrate the announcement of Dragon's Dogma 2. This is one of those games that's listed as unsupported, but again, that doesn't technically mean that the game won't run on Steam Deck. It just hasn't been verified. But yeah, I booted it up. It runs fine. One of the cutscenes didn't play the audio. That was about the only issue that I experienced on Steam Deck. Other than that, 60 frames per second runs pretty much perfectly. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. This is one of those games that just has a lot of trouble on Windows. It just constantly crashes when you try to boot it up, and there's some solutions like resetting your graphic settings by deleting certain files in the game's directory and stuff like that, but it was just very inconvenient to run on Windows. On Steam Deck, not once did it crash on boot up, and beyond that, the Steam Deck runs it better than the other devices I've tried it on. Mostly 60 frames per second, occasional dips into 50s, and if you cut enemies up into too many pieces, you'll see the frame rate drop to 40s, but other than that, very smooth experience across the board. Really impressed. Then we got Batman Arkham Origins, which ran beautifully. I maxed out the settings, and it was running at 60 frames per second. That includes the DirectX 11 enhancements that would slow down the game on other devices like the One X Player Mini and the One X Player. The Steam Deck had no trouble handling all of that, and still mostly running at 60 frames per second with a few minor dips here and there that really don't make much of a difference. I also downloaded Batman Arkham City just for the heck of it to try it out, and yeah, max settings, 60 frames per second, no problem. I did want to download Arkham Knight and try that game out, but again, that's an unsupported game that actually does not boot up on Steam Deck. Want to try some shooters? Downloaded Black Mesa, set it to medium to high settings, and it's mostly running at a smooth 60 frames per second, though there are some dips and stutters that occur when there's a lot going on, especially when it comes to physics, but overall, very playable, combined with the gyroscopic controls and all that jazz. Witcher 3 runs beautifully on this device, high settings, hairworks off. I did reduce the shadow quality to medium, but with those settings, I was getting a smooth 45 to 55 frames per second average, usually hovering in the 50s. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, beautifully optimized for PC. At high settings, I was getting a smooth 60 frames per second, edging out the other One X Player devices that I use, where the frame rate would sit sort of closer to the 55 to 60 frames per second. On the Steam Deck, it basically didn't dip below 60, and the game looked phenomenal on this 7-inch screen to boot. Control. Now, this is one of the more demanding games. I did set this to low settings, but Control is one of those games where low settings is still demanding, and on a smaller screen, low settings looks like medium to high settings. And at low settings with the Steam Deck, I was getting a very playable and smooth 45 to 60 frames per second, depending on how busy the screen was. A big improvement over, say, the One X Player Mini, where I got closer to a 30 to 50 FPS range with a 40 FPS average. It was just a bit more stuttery, also low settings, still very playable, but on Steam Deck, it was just so much smoother, and it made gyro aiming just that much smoother and better. Next up, Outer Wilds. This is a game that surprises me in how poorly it seems to perform, given that its graphics aren't the highest fidelity. But on Steam Deck, it does run better than what I experienced on One X Player and One X Player Mini. We're looking at 40 to 60 frames per second average at medium settings, whereas the One X Player ran it at 30 to 50 frames per second, sort of 10 frames per second lower in terms of range. Now, one of the cool things you can do on Steam Deck is limit a game like Outer Wilds, which doesn't always run at 60 frames per second, to something like 40 or 45 frames per second, and just smooth out the inconsistent performance, make it less stuttery, and playing it like that was really ideal. Death Stranding also ran very well on the Steam Deck. I basically cranked the settings up to very high, and I was getting 35 to 45 frames per second. A few stutters below 30 FPS if I was going really fast with the motorcycle, but at normal travel speed, yeah, 35 to 45, relatively smooth gameplay, very playable, and this is a game that certainly looks very pretty on this smaller, more condensed screen. I also tried out Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, high settings, Fidelity FX at balanced, ray tracing at medium, 55 to 60 frames per second. Average, significantly better than the more inconsistent and stuttery performance I was getting on the One X Player Mini. I did try to boot up Halo Infinite, but again, the game just doesn't work on this device, so it's hard for me to really gauge the performance of that game on Steam Deck. But I did recently purchase God of War on sale for PC, booted that up on Steam Deck, medium to high settings, Fidelity FX unbalanced, 35 to 45 frames per second average, very playable and looked super good on the smaller screen. It doesn't feel like long ago when I played this game on that big chonky PlayStation 4, and now to see it run on this small portable device. This is when it hit me that technology has come this far. Moving on, Cyberpunk 2077. So CD Projekt actually updated the game to have Steam Deck specific default settings. It's a mix of like low to high to ultra settings with Fidelity FX on. The frame rate was limited to 30 frames per second by default. I increased it to 45 frames per second, and with that I was in fact getting an average of 30 to 45 frames per second. I rarely see that game reach 50 frames per second at those settings, so I limited it to 45. It's a very playable experience, and with gyro controls, aiming weapons and guns at enemies is just a really great feeling. Now, there were a few occasions where the frame rate can dip below 30. So, for example, that first Night City mission car chase, in that sequence, I did see the frame rate dip to like an average of like 25 frames per second. But those moments are fewer and further between than the moments where the game is running at 30 to 45 frames per second. Very playable frame rate. Then comes Elden Ring, one of the most performance-intensive games. This is a game where you do have to limit the frame rate to 30 frames per second. Now, Valve actually released an update for the Steam Deck to specifically address the kind of stuttery performance of Elden Ring. I use what I like to call the Digital Foundry settings, which is a combination of medium to high settings, and limited the frame rate to 30, and it was just a locked 30 frames per second. Very occasional micro dips into the high 20s, but for the most part, rock solid, very playable 30, portable Elden Ring to go. I mean, come on. For my last game, I did want to try Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, but as I mentioned before, the game just crashes. It gives me an error message, and I don't know what to do about it. So this is one of those games that I'm going to label as incompatible, at least in my experience. All right, so that's that for PC gaming performance. It is easily the best performing device out of the ones that I've used. And what's crazy is that the Steam Deck is a 15 TDP device, whereas the other ones that I've used, they go up to like 28 TDP, and the One X Player Mini is using the latest 12th gen Intel chip and whatnot. And yet the Steam Deck, something about the way Valve tweaked the system on chip and made it just a bit more custom made, a bit more proprietary, and the way they optimized things, I don't know what they did, really. But whatever they did worked wonders, because the Steam Deck just, in terms of both value, which I'll get to in a bit, and performance, it just knocks the competition out of the water. That brings us to emulation performance, where the Steam Deck did admirably in all areas except for Nintendo Switch. I'll get to that in a bit. Let's first talk about 3DS emulation via Citra. I was initially concerned that the Steam Deck wouldn't run 3DS games very well because Citra is known for having less than ideal Vulkan support, and given that the Steam Deck houses an AMD chip, it does rely on Vulkan. But I was pleasantly surprised to find that unlike the chonky One X Player, the AMD version that I reviewed a few months back that struggled with 3DS emulation, on Steam Deck, Zelda Majora's Mask 3D was running at a smooth 30 frames per second. The One X Player, I remember, was running that at like 20 frames per second in that area. Metroid Samus Returns was running very smoothly at 30 frames per second. Nary a hitch, if any. Pretty much ran perfectly. 3DS games just work. I was expecting the worst, but was pleasantly surprised to discover that the Steam Deck handles 3DS emulation very, very competently. Same goes for GameCube and Wii emulation via Dolphin. I'm going to show you Metroid Prime Trilogy here, running at 60 frames per second. Almost flawless. A few, dips here and there, which is typical with emulation, but overall, beautiful performance. And the gyro controls on Metroid Prime Trilogy are freaking awesome. There's actually a Steam community controller profile for Prime Hack that you can just download, and I just downloaded that, tweaked a few things, and I was up and running. But yeah, suffice to say that if a game has good compatibility with Dolphin, the Steam Deck will run GameCube Wii games flawlessly. PlayStation 2, same thing. I ran Devil May Cry 3 and Silent Hill 2 on the PCSX2. Basically no issues whatsoever. I was getting a flawless 60 FPS on both. Wii U emulation was also very good. Not 100% perfect, but very, very good. I ran Wii U games through Cemu. It does perform slightly worse than the 1X Player Mini with the 12th Gen Intel chip, but just by a couple frames. So Zelda Breath of the Wild, for example, on Cemu, using the 60 frames per second mod or hack, I was getting 40 to 45 frames per second outdoors and 55 to 60 frames per second indoors, whereas on the 1X Player Mini, I was getting a consistent locked 60 frames per second indoors in the area that I tested indoors on. But honestly, that's not enough of a difference for it to affect your gameplay experience all that much. Other games like Zelda Twilight Princess and Wind Waker HD ran perfectly on Steam Deck, solid 30 frames per second, no dips. But then in other games like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, which runs at 60 frames per second on Wii U, I saw the frame rate fluctuate between 55 and 60 frames per second, whereas on the 1X Player Mini, I was getting locked 60 FPS. So there was just less of those like very minute micro stutters that you occasionally get on the Steam Deck because it's fluctuating between 55 and 60, but still very smooth, very playable. Most people will probably not notice the difference. Mario 3D World, same thing, 57 frames per second average, doesn't quite hit 60 consistently like the 1X Player Mini does, but also again, you'd be hard-pressed to notice that stuff. Tokyo Mirage Sessions was getting mostly 30 frames per second on Steam Deck, occasional dips into the high 20s, but overall no issues. Xenoblade Chronicles X, 30 frames per second average, also some occasional minor dips into like 27, 28, 29 FPS, but mostly 30 FPS. Wii U games just straight up are not too far off from 1X Player Mini, but it's still worth noting that the 1X Player Mini did slightly edge out the Steam Deck when it comes to Wii U emulation. Now, when it comes to Switch emulation, the Steam Deck, unfortunately, falls quite short of the 1X Player Mini. Zelda Breath of the Wild, for example, 15 frames per second in-game and 30 frames per second in menus on the Steam Deck. I would not call Breath of the Wild on Switch, on Yuzu, playable, though of course, you might as well just load it up on the Wii U, on Cemu. But just for testing purposes, on 1X Player Mini, I was getting 30 frames per second, so there's just no comparison right there. Same goes for Kirby and the Forgotten Land. I was getting 20 to 30 frames per second on the Steam Deck, and you know, it was stuttery enough where I wouldn't play this game on the Steam Deck, whereas on the 1X Player Mini, I actually turned on the 60 frames per second mod slash hack, and I was getting an average of 40 to 60 frames per second, pretty much twice the performance that I got on Steam Deck. Mario Kart 8, same thing. Overall was very playable on Steam Deck with frame rates ranging from 40 to 60 FPS, mostly in the region of 50 to 60 FPS, but on the 1X Player Mini, during races, the frame rate never dipped below 60. It never fluctuated into the 40s and 50s. It was just locked at 60 frames per second. Xenoblade Chronicles, same thing. I was getting 25 to 30 frames per second average. A bit stuttery feeling, still very playable, but this was at 0.75 resolution, whereas on the 1X Player Mini at full 1X resolution, I was getting a less stuttery and more consistent 30 frames per second. And last but not least, Astral Chain was, I would say, unplayable in certain sections on Steam Deck, getting frame rate averages between 10 to 30 frames per second. I booted up the same graphics-intensive area that the Steam Deck was struggling with on the 1X Player Mini, and I was getting locked 30 frames per second, occasional dips into like 29, 28, but much, much more playable. So the Steam Deck Switch emulation support, the Yuzu support, is just not there. I would not play Switch games on the Steam Deck unless they are of lighter graphics fidelity. So look, if emulation were my number one priority, I might pick the 1X Player Mini because it runs everything across the board, including Switch emulation, so well. But what Steam Deck is, it's a better all-around device. As long as you can deal with Switch not being as emulatable on Steam Deck compared to other devices, or as long as you're willing to wait until Yuzu's Steam Deck support gets better, you're still looking at a device that does PC gaming performance better, that still emulates most things well enough and emulates most things pretty great, in fact, and that has more options in terms of inputs, that is really comfortable to use, that I think is currently the ultimate portable PC gaming device. If you're willing to deal with software caveats like not everything being compatible on the Steam Deck yet in terms of games, Linux and stuff like that, and having to relearn some things, how to do them on Linux instead of Windows, and some of the software bugs, those things and Switch emulation are the biggest flaws that I can find on this device. But that aside, everything else has been fantastic. I would carry this around. If I had to pick one, I would pick this. There's also a device that deals with thermals pretty well. It does get a bit hot sort of towards the back here, towards the middle, but the grips are far away from that middle, and the heat never bleeds to the grips, so you're always going to be comfortable right here. And as long as you keep this vent back here open and let the air be expelled, the device will be cooled at 15 TDP. And the fan noise has really not been an issue. Like, it is very much audible, but because the speakers are so freaking good, it completely blots out the fan noise. And even without the speakers, it's not an annoying, super high pitch fan noise. It's more of a hum that you notice when it kicks in, but eventually just kind of fades into the background. As for how long you'll be able to play games on the Steam Deck, obviously it depends on how much power the game is drawing from the device and what settings you set the device to. So I've got a worst case scenario, which is playing a high intensity game like Control. I put the brightness up to 75%. This is a game that does push the Steam Deck, and I didn't limit any performance whatsoever. I was looking at 1.5 hours total, an hour and 30 minutes of gameplay. Now, if you use a high-capacity battery bank like this one right here that outputs at least 45 watts, then you can extend the battery life by quite a bit. This specific battery bank got me on Control, same settings, 75% brightness, 60 hertz refresh rate, no performance limited whatsoever. It got me an extra 4 hours and 10 minutes of gameplay on top of the 1.5 hours. So that's a grand total of 5 hours and 40 minutes of Control gameplay on Steam Deck with the battery bank plus the internal battery. That's a pretty decent amount of gameplay you can do right there with a AAA game. But of course, you do have to carry this extra device with you, being the disadvantage. But I carry a battery bank with me all the time anyway, so for me, it's like not a big deal at all. So that's kind of the worst case scenario, just internal battery and also with battery bank. The best case scenario, I tried a low intensity game. I emulated Metroid Zero Mission on a Game Boy Advance emulator, set the brightness to 50%, lower the TDP all the way down to 3, and lower the GPU clock all the way down to 200. The game was still running great. It was still running at 60 frames per second, and I managed to get over 7 hours of battery life out of this Game Boy Advance title. And if you use a battery bank like the one I have for these low-intensity games, you're pretty much looking at all-day battery life. And that's really the great thing about that quick access menu, is that you can really fine-tune the performance of this device based on what you're doing and extend battery life or increase power based on your needs. It's a fantastic feature that allows you to get the most out of the Steam Deck if you know what you're doing and if you're willing to take that extra step of tweaking your games. This brings us to the final portion of the review, value. This is where Steam Deck utterly destroys the competition, whereas other devices like the 1X Player Mini here or the chonky 1X Player cost over $1,000. With Steam Deck, you're looking at 3 versions that are much cheaper than the competitors. There's the $400 version with a 64 gigabyte eMMC drive. You've got the $500 version that comes with a fast 256 gigabyte NVMe SSD, and the one I have here is a $650 version that comes with a 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD with that anti-glare coating and the exclusive carrying case that is not much different from the carrying case you'll get on the other models. The logo is a little different. There's like some aesthetic differences, but nothing all that major, really. The most expensive version of this device is $650. It comes with a carrying case, a really high-quality carrying case to boot. it performs better than other devices that I've tested when it comes to PC gaming performance. Emulation, for the most part, works really well, with Switch being the only emulation that the Steam Deck struggles with. When looking at it from a pure value perspective, this is by far the best device on the market. Now, do keep in mind that this landscape is constantly evolving, and already I'm hearing rumblings of next-gen versions of devices like One X Player and Ioneo and whatnot that are going to house hardware that are significantly more powerful than the Steam Deck, and depending on how that stuff's optimized, we might, in the not-so-distant future, see competitors outdo the Steam Deck in terms of gameplay performance. But right here, right now, and at this price point, the Steam Deck is just such a compelling value proposition. I'll say again, what a time to be alive, to be able to get a device that is this small and yet is able to play high-end AAA games at very, very playable performance. If this is just Steam Deck 1, imagine what Steam Deck 2 will accomplish in terms of PC portable gaming performance. I'm already excited for Steam 2, and I'm in love with Steam Deck 1. It still has some kinks to iron out for sure on the software side of things, but that's a matter of when, not if. As it sits right now, it's still a very, very functional and exceeding my expectations device that I'm going to be using every day. And it's genuinely changed my PC gaming habits. I just find myself PC gaming a lot more because I can do it so much more comfortably and so much more conveniently and on the go to boot without being limited by the location I'm in, without being limited by, do I have the surface that I need to set my laptop down and whatever. Just wherever I can pick up this device and hold it, I can just play AAA PC games, and anything below AAA runs pretty much flawlessly on this powerful device. Now, the one thing I still haven't tried is using the Steam Deck as a PC, but for that, I'm waiting for the official dock to launch. Maybe by then we'll see some more updates to enhance all that. But for this review, I just wanted to focus on the PC portable gaming experience. The desktop experience, again, I'll do when the official dock comes out, and I'll edit the entire video just using the Steam Deck and make the entire video using the Steam Deck as a PC, see how that goes, and then report back is what I hope to do. For now, though, this is my review of the Steam Deck and my gaming experience on this wonderful, amazing device that will be a daily part of my life from here on out. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear that I like this thing. I like this thing quite a bit. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this device based on this review or based on your own hands-on experience with the Steam Deck, if you own one or if you've borrowed one. And if you haven't gotten one yet, do you plan to get one sooner rather than later? Is this a device that would appeal to you, or would it, change your PC gaming habits in some way? Share what you think about the Steam Deck in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.